Horror games have been around for a very long time, but good horror games didn't really start to take off until the late 90s and early 2000s. They had an especially big boom in the early 2010s when Let's Plays truly became a thing, letting players share their experience with whoever wanted to tune in. Now, years later, the amount of quality horror games continues to increase. Games like Alien Isolation, Outlast, Resident Evil, and while all these games are great in their own right, two consistently stay on my mind. Silent Hill 2 is a classic game that defined horror with its unsettling but unique storytelling. Until Dawn, on the other hand, is a modern game that manages to take those defined tropes and execute them in a way we hadn't seen before. Now, both of these masterpieces have just been brought back to life, and honestly, I couldn't be happier. Silent Hill 2 is my favorite old school horror game, and Until Dawn, my favorite modern one. So what happens when two titans in the horror game genre come back around at the same time? Do they still hold up years later? My name is Gambit, and welcome to Silent Hill and Until Dawn, defining timeless horror. Let's start with the psychological roller coaster that is Silent Hill. Silent Hill 2 is honestly a very special game to me. There are countless videos out there dissecting it, but I wanted to share my experience. My first big exposure to Silent Hill was around 2020 when the first collaboration with Dead by Daylight had just been announced. I had heard of the franchise before, and I've watched the first movie, but I still to this day haven't touched the original Silent Hill 2, but it still managed to become one of my favorite video games of all time. And that's saying something. After watching through an 8+ hour playthrough with a friend of mine, I learned about the game's lore and story and have been a fan ever since. Even taking a look back, Silent Hill has always managed to be ahead of the pack in terms of psychological horror, from the monster designs and hidden meanings to even simpler but just as impactful things like the game's soundtrack. For example, let's take a quick listen to Promise. The song manages to create a calming and warm sound in such a lonely and cold environment. Every aspect of the game is worth looking into for reasons just like this, and things become even more meaningful when you begin to understand the game's hidden messages and subtleties. This game is an emotional roller coaster. Every time you discover something, you also find yourself with more questions. It's like an almost never-ending case of curiosity. Even looking at the game's monsters. What should just be a batch of enemies meant to be taken down by whatever cool weapon the player picks up, is instead another batch of hidden meanings to the characters around them. What would usually just be a cool boss fight is instead another piece of the puzzle, a piece that connects to a story of abuse or hatred, all disguised as an in-game hurdle. Silent Hill is the only series I've seen do this, and do it so well. Its side characters also pique that same curiosity. Side characters often are in a role that is meant to help the player piece things together, but the faces in Silent Hill only manage to add more questions to the player's mind. Why is there a little girl here? Or what happened to this woman's family? The answers depend on different people, but Silent Hill is different for every person who walks in it. And this is really reflected in the game's endings. I don't want to spoil the endings for anyone, yes, endings plural, but I did want to touch on how this game can be different for everyone who plays it. Each ending takes a drastically different approach from the last. The creators of Silent Hill never confirmed which ending is actually canon, so it's been left up to the fans to decide. While we can try our best to decipher, we will never really know how the game ends, and that mystery is such a risk, but it does pay off very well in the end. But each ending you get is all dependent on the player and their choices. Overall, Silent Hill 2 is a masterclass in subtlety. Its characters, monsters, and hidden details throughout the game all contribute to an amazing story. A story that is just begging to be uncovered. Until Dawn was a game everyone was fond of when it first came out, and that still seems to hold true today. The game takes a very different approach to horror, one that decides to use a lot of popular horror ideas and throw them all at the player at once. You have the on-the-nose ones like jump scares, monsters, ghost stories, and gore, but you also have more passive fears like small spaces or feeling like you're being watched. All of this impressively adds up to a strong gameplay loop, interesting story beats, and an instinct of survival for not only one, but 8 different characters. The game does have a lot of ideas, but it never feels overbearing. Somehow Until Dawn tackles a lot of different concepts at once and pulls it off nicely. My first big example of this would be the butterfly effect. This is something that the game emphasizes in the beginning, a strong idea of choice. Every time you make an important choice at any point in the game, you'll see butterflies appear in the corner, reminding the player every step of the way that they are making a decision, and that decision can have consequences. And that's not Until Dawn's only example of taking a strong concept and running with it. The strong tie with Native American beliefs feels right at home too, and is a very important part of the game. Not only do we see this in one of the game's main antagonists being the Wendigo, but even built into the gameplay loop with every totem we find as well. Speaking of antagonists, Until Dawn manages to have 3 separate ones, at least for a good portion of the story. You have the monster in the woods, the psycho in the cabin, and the pyromaniac, but once again, it never feels like too much. Until Dawn also does an excellent job with secondary objectives and storytelling. It does make sure to use a more direct approach whenever it can, but it doesn't stray away from keeping its sense of mystery or to help drop clues to the game to aid the player. The therapy sessions and the totems are both great examples of this. When in the sessions, you'll want to ask questions, like who is this character we are talking to? Who are we playing as? Or how are we even here in the first place? And these are all questions that will be answered eventually, but not before the game tries to ask you about your deepest fears and feelings. The totems, on the other hand, aid the player by giving hints at a future event. They do not give you a lot to go off of though, but that's what makes them so great. It makes the player keep such an intense focus on every scene consciously and subconsciously. If you remember seeing something in the vision, like a character wearing a jacket, that is something you'll be paying attention to in the future scenes. And this really doesn't get old for me. The game even rewards you by showing you more of the history of the location you play in. The mechanic doesn't hold your hand to get you through the game safely, it gives you a fighting chance, and the rest is up to you. And when I say the rest is up to you, the rest is up to you. Until Dawn's cast of characters really brings the game to life, and it's the player's job to navigate them through each obstacle. The game introduces you to its strong cast of characters from the get-go. You see the character's name, traits about them, and sometimes even likes or dislikes. And of course, this is all to help the player feel more attached, and attached you will be. In Until Dawn, every choice you make decides who lives and who doesn't, and it can sometimes be really easy to mess things up and lose someone. Sometimes the odds are just stacked against you, and the game makes you feel extreme suspense and tension, making you feel it even more when you make a mistake. Just like the game sets out to do, your actions, every choice you make, all has an effect on the world around you, and that is what makes Until Dawn so great. At the time of me making this video, I've only gone through a handful of hours of each of these games' remakes, and I can say with confidence I am so happy to have the opportunity to experience these games all over again. If you like this video, please make sure to give it a like and subscribe. We're challenging ourselves here to see if we can hit 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so every bit of help is definitely appreciated. If you managed to make it this far, enjoy a little quick teaser for our next video.